Morning, everyone. Mark Crowther, Chair of the Department of Medicine here at McMaster University, and this is Chair's Grand Rounds again. We're going back to something a little bit normal this time rather than our usual COVID-related discussion. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Lahana Tabani, who's a professor of biostatistics and was the immediate past interim chair of the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence, and Impact. He has numerous awards to his name. Lahana is one of the principal biostatisticians and thought leaders in the analysis of research who's based at McMaster. He's an elected member of the International Statistics Institute, a fellow of the American Statistical Association, a fellow of the Society for Clinical Trials, and a fellow of the Canadian Academy for Health Sciences. And he won the 2020 Anna Neil MacArthur Annual Research Award here at St. Joe's. He is the editor-in-chief of a journal known as Pilot and Feasibility Studies, and he's a member of the editorial board for many journals, including Trials and Clinical Trials. And he has more than 800 peer-reviewed manuscripts and has really contributed in important ways, not just to the day-to-day workload of analyzing studies, but also to the thought process about how we actually innovate in the clinical trials arena. Today, he's going to talk about revisiting the debate on whether it's time to get rid of statistical significance. And I'll just remind everybody, if you have questions, to ask them in the question and answer function, not in the chat function. The chat function is really hard for me to monitor. If I can answer any of the questions in real time in the question and answer box, I'll do that. And if I can answer them in real time, we'll ask Dr. Tabani at the end to provide some comments and answer some of the questions. So without further ado, Lahana, please take it away.
Thanks, Mark. That's very kind of you. All right, so I'll just go into it. So the issue of really what to do with statistical significance has been an ongoing issue for a very long time, simply because of the many challenges which I'll touch on about statistical significance. You probably may have seen this article last year that was published in Nature, which was advocating for retirement of the poor statistical significance. I'll come back to this article because really prompted this discussion. So what I hope to share with you today is really the connection between statistical thinking and evidence-based practice, and a bit of history of where statistical significance or p-value thresholds really came from, and some of the practical challenges that we have with it. And then I'll touch briefly on the ongoing debate about really what to do with statistical significance. And we'll realize that it's really not that simple. It's quite a challenging thing. But there are some suggestions really of how to perhaps shift our focus away from it on something else that could probably be of more importance, which is clinical relevance. And then I'll finish with some concluding remarks about really why you as scientists or people who really are in the front line of care using evidence to make clinical decisions, you should care. Now, this is George Wells. Some people have referred to him as the father of science. He was actually born in England and had lots of things in his life. He was a teacher, novelist, and journalist. And he wrote quite a number of notable works along the way. But in statistics, we actually know George Wells as somebody who made a very audacious prediction. And I quote, "Statistical thinking will someday be as necessary for efficient citizenship as the ability to read and write." Who ever thought that this would actually come true? All right, now what is statistical thinking? Quite often really in life, we actually do see things, we collect data, we can see the distributions, and so we can describe what we're able to observe. And there are various ways and tools we can use to be able to help us observe patterns. But we also wonder about population distributions or mechanisms that actually generated the data, whether we could make inferences about how the evidence was or information was generated. And then we worry about the context, is it of good quality? Could there be other explanation that could have actually generated this? And we often really benchmark these things with our own expectations, maybe hypotheses, models, and we worry about other surprises and so on. So in a nutshell, this is really how we think about information, and we call this statistical thinking. In health, is really about advancing the welfare and health of a society. through optimal use of information, whether we are planning, diagnosing, preventing, treating, or managing health conditions. And we really think about information in the similar manner. And one can really think of statistical thinking as no different from evidence-based thinking, where the piece at the center is really information. Of course, with the arrival of COVID, we now have really realized that statistical thinking as a necessary requirement for good citizenship has become true. I mean, really, when you think about what's happening around the world, every citizen now is expected to understand how to behave to flatten the curve. You look everywhere. This has been a message with public health officials trying to get every citizen to understand what it means. This is really all about using information, perhaps to make better decisions. People are asked to really understand what it means to bend the curve, which is really trying to reduce hospitalizations and so on. And of course, there's pictures everywhere. We're all bombarded by things that are really trying to find better ways of communicating information in ways that help us to be able to control this pandemic. And every single citizen is expected to understand all these issues. So suddenly, statistics really has become a necessary aspect of really advancing societal welfare and protecting all of us from this devastating pandemic. However, we cannot really fully appreciate the clinical relevance of any evidence unless we adopt statistical thinking in how we collect, synthesize, and interpret that evidence. I would argue that one of the first things we really need is pragmatic evidence in whatever we do. There's growing evidence showing that many of the therapies, interventions that are used in routine care really are not based on evidence that was connected in routine settings. We rely mostly on evidence collected under ideal settings. And this was really an illustration in middle income countries, but I would say this happens across all settings. The second thing is there's so many barriers we encounter in about translating evidence into practice. And one of the most challenging things is really about how we report information with lots of things that are essential not being reported appropriately. And sometimes even when things are reported, people are really putting a lot of spin on things. And I'll come back to this issue of spin as we go through the talk. Let me step back a little bit because this is about p-values and talk about statistical significance and its origins. This is R.A. Fisher. Many people think of Fisher really as the father of modern statistics, and others have described him as a genius who almost single-handedly created the foundations of modern statistical science as we know it today. But really, when you think about it, statistics as a discipline, where it was one of those areas that was really founded by people who themselves were not statisticians. This is Reverend Bayes Thomas. People know about Bayesian statistics. He was just a statistics enthusiast, but actually ended up creating one of the fundamental foundations of statistics, particularly Bayesian statistics. R.A. Fisher himself was a geneticist. He wasn't a statistician as such. And Carl Pearson, who was one of his mentors, was a lawyer and a mathematician. Perhaps you could say, well, Pearson was more of a statistician because of his mathematical background. But really, when you think about people who really make big discoveries in statistical practice and science, themselves not statisticians as we know it. Let me go back to R.A. Fisher. Born in England, moved to Australia, and he had lots of other people who really influenced his work, including Carl Pearson himself and Charles Darwin. But one of the things that Fisher did was he wrote a book which he called Statistical Methods for Research Workers. And in that book, I quote, he wrote that the value for which p is equal to 0.05 or 1 in 20 is 1.96 or nearly 2. It is convenient to take this point as a limit in judging whether a deviation is to be considered significant or not. And this was perhaps the beginning of really the use of the term significant in connection to the p-value of 0.05. But Fisher continued to advocate that, much as we can use as a standard level of concluding that the evidence is against the null hypothesis being tested, it should not be used as an absolute rule. And he didn't actually even stop there. P-value is defined between 0 and 1. He actually really talked about the entire spectrum within which one could get a p-value, that if it's between 0.1 and 0.9, there's certainly no reason to suspect the hypothesis tested. If it's below 0.02, it is strongly indicated that the hypothesis fails to account for whole of the facts. We shall not often be astray if we draw a conventional line at 0.05. So he didn't just talk about a single value, he talked about spectrum. But for whatever reason, people focused on the alpha of 0.05, and it was then introduced in statistical science as really that criteria for judging statistical significance. And it has now become pretty much ritualistic in medical research, and people don't even think twice about really what else to use. Now, others have argued that the accept reject philosophy of statistical testing based on this magical P of 0.05 remains dominant in the minds of many non-statisticians. This is Stuart Pocock, one of our colleagues in the UK, who's really dedicated a lot of his career in advancing clinical trials. But to be honest, I would suggest that the blame goes to both statisticians and non-statisticians alike. The reason being, non-statisticians are taught by and collaborate with statisticians. So we can have a non-statistical colleagues taking the blame for this practice. So what are the practical challenges with statistical significance or placing threshold on p-values, such as the one that we use so commonly? The first thing is there's an overwhelming evidence showing that over 90% of published articles report p-values that are less than this threshold. However, many of these claims, John Ioannidis have shown that they really highlight a lot of false positives, right? So you can imagine, if we have this high likelihood of results that really report small p-values, and yet they are really indicative of false positive research, this is really a problem. The second thing is lack of statistical significance is quite often interpreted as absence of evidence. This is Martin Blunt and Doug Altman, and many times they've tried to caution people that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, right? Why? Because usually underpowered studies will often yield results that are not statistically significant. And this is a very good example of a situation where for patients with renal insufficiency, the trial was trying to figure out whether if you discontinue a combination versus continuing that combination, would this yield more good than harm? And if you look at the p-value, it's very large, which is 0.16, and therefore the risk ratio is really not statistically significant. But if you look at the magnitude of this thing, there's 41% relative risk reduction with a absolute risk difference of 7.5. And many people would argue that this is clinically important. But the problem of not being able to detect statistical significance of the effect is because of small sample size leading to fewer events. To be honest, the issue of having results that are clinically important but not statistical significance is only an issue for us to worry about if it's common. The issue is how common is it, right? This was a study really trying to actually figure out the same question, and they looked at what was happening in cardiovascular trials. They had 127 of these trials, and 92 of them had results on the primary outcome that was not statistically significant. And of the 92 trials that were not statistically significant, 61% of them had an estimate that was actually bigger than the lower level of the confidence interval, which means really was potentially clinically meaningful, right? In other words, really having findings that are not statistical significance but clinically important are very common. Cardiovascular trials is really not the only area where this happens. Many clinical areas, you'll find the same thing, where you find lots of small studies that do not have statistical significance, but the findings really do have a signal of clinical importance, which is why many reporting guidelines trying to encourage people to really think about sampling designs, about justifying how much information to collect in the first place before you do the study. The Spirit guideline strongly encourages this. This is one of the key elements. The Spirit guidelines is really used for reporting protocols of clinical trials. And if you look at the consort statement, which is about reporting of trials and the trend for observational study and stroke, they're really all about, they all have an element of the sample size. The idea is simple: to be able to avoid missing clinically important differences if they exist, or to be able to avoid getting statistical significance by chance. In short, p-values from underpowered trials are really difficult to interpret. Tom Fleming is one of our colleagues, actually came to visit McMaster not long ago as the Janice Polk lecturer. He often really cautioned people that p-values are only interpretable if you understand the sampling context, including how much information was determined as necessary before the study was done to be able to guard against these problems. It could also go the other way. And overpowered studies will often yield results that are statistically significant, but they may have no clinical relevance or importance. This is another trial which had lots of patients in it, and it showed really absolute risk reduction about 2.1%. A p-value is highly significant with the number needed to treat of 48. And people will argue that really 2.1 on an absolute risk scale is really not that clinically relevant. But the p-value is very, very small, showing that it's really highly significant simply because of very large sample size. I just want you to be aware that if you really express the result in relative terms, you have 17% relative risk reduction, which seems like something really big, which is why one should always be cautious when results are expressed in relative terms, because relative terms tend to really exaggerate the effect more than if you really expressed it in absolute terms. 4, this is Mike Walsh, one of our colleagues now in nephrology. And Mike Walsh really introduced the concept of fragility of trials a few years ago. And really one of the things that he demonstrated that reliance on statistical significance show that trials in many clinical areas are very fragile. So what's a fragility index? If you have a trial comparing two interventions A and B, and you show that the two treatments are significantly different using a Fisher's test with a p-value less than this threshold of 0.05. Now, if you really wanted to check whether this trial is fragile or not fragile, you then move patients from non-event to event in the treatment of interest. This case is A, and the number of patients you move until you change the statistical significance, we call that F, the fragility index of a trial. If I have to move small number of patients to reverse statistical significance, we call such a trial very fragile. But if it takes a lot more patients to actually reverse that, we say it is really less fragile. Actually, it's more fragile if it takes a smaller number of patients, right? Now, after introduction of this concept, many people started applying it in their own clinical areas to find out how fragile are the trials in their own areas. This was anesthesiology trials. This was done in orthopedic trials. This was done in spine surgery, emergency medicine, stroke. This is also stroke. This was ophthalmology, and all show that trials in these areas are incredibly fragile. In fact, one of my students actually looked at a survey of all these reviews of fragility in different clinical areas, and the average was 4. It takes only 4 patients to reverse statistical significance. So much as people really often get excited when they get statistical significance, and the media catch-ups on this, really, when you look at it, most of this evidence is absolutely fragile. Now, the other thing is p-values are routinely misinterpreted, and part of it because they're not intuitive in the way they're interpreted. We have lots of examples of interpretations of p-values claiming that there's no effect, the effectiveness of one intervention did not differ from that of another, or there's no difference in outcomes. And many of these poorly worded statements is because people are really struggling to interpret the p-value correctly. And one could argue that perhaps we need to do a better job trying to do this. But when you think about it, we have been doing this for decades, and still we continue to have lots of misinterpretation because p-values are not really intuitive. The other thing about reliance on statistical significance, it really promotes unethical practices in the conduct of science through p-hacking. And there's a lot of empirical evidence showing that p-hacking is widespread in the scientific literature, including in medical and health sciences. So what is p-hacking? It is really when we collect, select data, or perform statistical analysis until a result that was not statistically significant becomes statistically significant. There are various ways we could actually do this. We could collect more data until we get significance, collect and analyze lots of data, but only report those that are significant, select variables until you get significance, exclude patients until you get significance. And if none of this actually work, just get one of the statistical colleagues, they will transform the data for you until you get significance. Now, the unfortunate consequence of this is that it really makes reproducing science much more difficult because people who engage in this type of practice don't often provide all the necessary details for us to be able to reproduce what they did. Now, p-values really, or significance, it is partly responsible for research misconduct leading to retractions due to misbehavior among scientists through falsifying or fabricating data. And if you look at the retraction watch, for those of you who may actually follow this, the majority of the papers that have been retracted, many of them actually had statistically significant findings. And really, we can see how this is practice that's really not helpful. If you look at the definition of publication bias, it's a propensity for journals to actually only publish results that show statistical significance and reject the ones that do not show it. We only have this because of statistical significance. So if we didn't have to rely so much on statistical significance, perhaps the term or the concept publication bias would certainly not even exist. This was a survey of the Cochrane reviews to see really how they deal with publication bias. And in this study, they actually came to a conclusion that meta-analysis today that are found in the Cochrane evidence of publication bias is very prevalent. So you can imagine that really if Cochrane reviews as what we would consider the gold standards of really doing evidence synthesis have this problem of publication bias, what hope would we have in other reviews that by other people outside of Cochrane? And certainly what hope would we have on guidelines that are based on this evidence? Because we synthesize evidence to be able to actually fit into guideline development. The other thing is significant findings that really tend to lead to overrepresentation of p-values in abstracts and press releases. It's very rare that when something is not statistically significant, you'll see that mentioned, including the p-value in the abstract. But if it's statistically significant, you bet the first thing that you'll see is a p-value that is actually very significant. That's really what gets the hype, and the press really gets on it. And there's really lots of evidence showing that this is absolutely prevalent in lots of areas. And the idea really is to be able to use it as a way to spin. We often really believe our theories and hypotheses, and anything that provides it in good light is really what people try to do with putting p-values in abstracts. Now, the other thing is p-values, conceptually, they're incredibly hard to understand. That's why they're not intuitive to interpret. And even the way you compute p-values, it's a conditional probability and condition on the null hypothesis being true. In other words, having no effect. And it's very difficult concept for people to understand, hence why it's actually so difficult to interpret. This is Frank Harrell, one of our colleagues in the US, who's really kept a list of all the problems that p-value really has as an indirect measure of some evidence against the null hypothesis. I encourage you to follow his website. So reliance on p-values really continues to be a challenge. And there's a lot more problems with it that I could go on, but I'll stop here. Now, there has been an ongoing debate with statistical significance, and this started in 2016 with the American Statistical Association actually now coming up front saying that, well, we need to have a statement on this so that people know where we stand as an association that's determined to really advance the best practice of statistical science. And their statement really had 6 principles in it. The first one was that they were reminding people that p-values really show you how compatible the data are with a specified model or hypothesis. They do not measure the probability that a studied hypothesis is true, which is a common misinterpretation that people often have of p-values. And they were encouraging people that really conclusions should not be based on whether a p-value is below or above some threshold. They should actually provide full transparent reporting of all the evidence using other measures. And they reminded people that p-values do not measure the size of an effect. And in fact, it does not provide a good measure of the evidence. And therefore, people should really rely on other things if you want to get a full picture of what the evidence is. Shortly after that, 2 years later, there was another group of practicing statisticians who came together and said, well, maybe we should change the threshold. What if we move it from 0.05 to a much lower one? You'll have fewer studies actually passing this threshold. This may actually reduce the thing. And John Ioannidis actually wrote an editorial for JAMA on this and thought it was really a good idea about this. And I'm talking about John. I'll come back to him because he's really one of the people who's dedicated a thoughtful process to really how to practice science in a way that allows it to be able to be reproducible. But a note of caution, because shortly after this proposal came out, there was a simulation study showing that, yes, we may be able to reduce the rates of false positive with this approach, but there would be increased propensity of overestimation of treatment effects. So this really is not an option because we solve one problem, we're getting another problem, which is equally bad. So move forward to last year, this was January. There was another group of statisticians who came together. This was really part of the American Statistical Association movement. Is still trying to find best ways to actually deal with this issue. They now dedicated the entire edition of another one of their journals, the American Statistician, to actually look at the issue, right? And really, they had this movement. They even dedicated this edition, and they call it Statistical Inference in the 21st Century, a world beyond p less than 0.05. In the editorial, the editors actually even caution people should stop saying something is statistically significant. And every time I gave a talk, I asked people to raise their hands. That was before COVID. Is there anyone who's prepared never to write in their scientific report that something was statistically significant? I've never seen anybody raise their hand. And that tells you how challenging change in practice would actually be. About the same time, now the number of people who really signing on to change in practice is increasing. This article came out in Nature, and it was really advocating abandoning statistical significance altogether. And it was signed on by 800 people. I don't know if any of you had actually signed on to this. There was lots of editorials about it in different magazines and journals of different associations, and it generated a lot of debates on both sides. Others really hailed it as a sensible and practical thing to do. It's about time all good things come to an end. And others really pushed back, and John Ioannidis really pushed back and say, hang on a minute, you're actually now giving bias a free pass. The reason is simple. If something is reported as being statistically significant, people pay attention to it, it gets media attention, and then scientists now start looking at it. Okay, let's look at the methodology. It's only when we look at the methodology would we see whether things were actually done in a way that's sound. And Colin Beck, who is the editor for clinical trials, actually said, really, the problem may not actually be p-values, it's just human behavior. Because we as scientists tend to really believe our own theories and often try to find ways that will actually, present information or evidence in a way that put those theories in good light. And this is often fueled by academic institutions who really have conflict of interest because they always want to get glory through their scientists. And of course, scientific journals who really are looking for citations and good impact factors. And it is in their best interest to get this thing through things that are cited by other people. And of course, the media, they just want to make stories. So it is really quite difficult to really change practice, and I don't think it will happen anytime soon. After all, really, to be honest, there's evidence that in cases where people have tried to say, all right, we're going to ban p-values and nobody's going to report them, it never really led to good science. So if you read these two articles, they were actually showing that banning p-values in some of these journals didn't really improve science. As this debate was raging, and I thought there wasn't going to be any change, the New England Journal of Medicine was actually the first one to actually say, actually, we're changing our guidelines in reaction to all this debate. And I looked at the change, and the change really didn't seem that substantial, because they were going to replace p-values with point estimates and confidence interval if the study protocol or the data analysis plan did not include adjustments for multiple testing. This didn't seem like much change, because these things are usually in the case where people are looking at secondary outcomes and so on, or multiple primary outcomes. To change, we will have to really overhaul our entire educational system and our academic culture, because part of the problem is, our academic incentives are not really supportive of real change in how we actually approach science. And this really is supportive with, Collins' conclusion that really, honestly, the problem may not necessarily be p-values. It's really just human behavior. It is incredibly difficult to change human behavior. It doesn't really matter what sphere it is. In the meantime, I think there's still things we could actually try to do to improve how we actually approach and report and interpret evidence. And the concept statement was actually published the first time in 1996, and it was actually updated in 2010. And if you look at really the concept statement as a guideline, it's not a validated tool or anything. It's just really a guideline providing recommendations about the minimal information that should be reported from a trial. They recommend really reporting, estimated confidence interval. There's no mention of reporting p-values, right? In other words, it's not even really the minimum information needed for someone to really understand what the evidence is from a trial. Reporting estimates with confidence interval would actually do equally as good. And you look at all the extensions, there's no mention of p-values anywhere. We actually did this for pilot and feasibility studies with a group of colleagues in the US, in the UK. And in the concept extension to pilot trials, we are very deliberate, discouraging reporting of p-values, because pilot studies or feasibility studies are not actually designed to address statistical significance. They are about establishing feasibility, and testing of significance or testing of effects is really a secondary issue. And therefore, reporting p-values would be meaningless, in fact, very hard to interpret, because they're not designed for that. So the emphasis really has always been on confidence intervals, estimate of effects and confidence intervals. The second thing is we could actually shift the focus on clinical relevance instead of p-values. And others have said, when we design trials, we often have the minimum clinically important difference, to help us design that. So now you report it, you have a confidence interval, you can check where the confidence interval lies relative to that threshold of the minimum clinically important difference, and therefore interpret the evidence accordingly, depending on where it lies as definite, probable, possible, or perhaps not possible. Let me remind you again that this really concept of minimum clinically important difference was really introduced by our colleagues, and we can certainly continue to rely on it as one of the things that can help us perhaps make better sense of what the evidence is, rather than relying on p-values. The other thing is we could actually completely abandon p-values or the use of statistical significance. In fact, in his editorial, John recommended various sensible options to really dealing with the issue. We could lower the p-value threshold, but I've already shown you that that won't solve it. We could abandon p-value thresholds. In other words, just report the p-value without seeing whether it's above or below something, or completely abandon p-values. The concept doesn't even require them anyway. Or we could rely on Bayesian statistics or Bayesian methods to do this. Focus on the effects with measure of uncertainty, which is confidence interval. And if none of these things really work, we could really perhaps look at how we train people and see whether we can refocus on efforts in training people better about how to approach science and report evidence and interpret it. Alternatively, we could perhaps focus on other dimensions of clinical relevance, because the concept of minimum clinically important difference has been a challenging thing for many people. Others have come up with what they call patient importance as something to focus on, or person significance, patient-centeredness. This is one of those things that even here in Canada, we actually use patient orientation as another concept. And the Canadian Institute of Health Research has also tried to advocate this as another dimension that we could focus on. Peter had another one that he called humanly important effects. And there's a lot more in the treatment of breast cancer, early breast cancer, if one is interested in reading more about it. My final thoughts is really statistical thinking is really not closely connected to evidence-based thinking, where we use information to make better decisions. We certainly don't need statistical significance to think statistically, right? However, one would argue that we need clinical relevance for really to be evidence-based. And ideally, one hopes that you won't get something that is not statistically significant and it's not even clinically relevant. Perhaps if it's not statistically significant, but it's clinically important, it may not be that bad, because if it was because of statistical power, with more information from other studies, things could be better. But if it's statistical significance, but not clinically helpful, it really won't be that helpful. This is the top quadrant where you really want to be, but it's not often the case that we have studies that land in that top quadrant. Now, the tragedy of really doing poor science and really relying so much on p-values is that there's a lot of examples showing that it could lead to serious public health consequences. And I'll give you an example with measles and MMR vaccine. You probably know the controversy. We've seen a lot of headlines about outbreaks of measles in this country. And the controversy really about this issue came out in 1919 with the Wakefield paper, published in the Lancet, which is one of the top journals, and it was retracted. And the study claimed that there was a causal link between the vaccine and development of autism. I don't have to say what autism is, because this is really your area. Everybody would understand what it is. However, there was overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Every systematic review after systematic review, they all showed that exposure to this vaccine was not likely to be associated with autism at all. So let's have a closer look at this study. It had 12 patients in it. It was really uncontrolled, but there was a claim that it was controlled, and I'll come to this issue because of the way this controlled patients were selected. It was really conveniently done to be able to show the hypothesis. And really the conclusions of the causal link were speculative more than anything else, not supported by the evidence that was provided. And there were other issues of serious ethical violations within the study. But I would argue that perhaps by far the most damaging thing that was done by this study was reporting of a p-value. And I'll tell you why this p-value of showing the association between the vaccine and some urinary methylmonic acid was really interpreted as indication of strong causal link with autism. This is a graph that was shown in the paper. And this is the p-value of the association showing the comparisons of the levels of this acid in two groups: the 12 patients that had autism and a select group of controlled patients that were claimed not to have autism. And they were measuring these levels of this acid and compared it. But the only thing that's reported is the p-value, right? I'm not a clinician, but there's widely available information that lack of vitamin B12 could also lead to variations in this level. And there's really no evidence to show that this is a very good surrogate marker of autism, nor was this presented in the paper itself. But I would say by far, perhaps one of the most damaging things about the reporting of this study was putting the p-value in the abstract. In fact, if you look at what's reported in the abstracts on the findings, is perhaps the only quantitative measure of evidence as claimed by the author that was actually reported in the abstract. That goes back to the issue that John raised earlier on, that often when there's statistical significance, guess where you'll find it? In the abstract. in the form of a p-value, right? Unfortunately, the seeds of doubt and confusion had already been planted with serious health consequences. That's where the vaccine coverage in the UK before the publication of the study in 1998. And you can see the change immediately following the publication. They kept going down until they were below 80%. And so really you can see how much damage the study had done in the country at the time. Fast forward to 2019. This is US, this was end of last year. We're talking about cases of measles. And to be honest, a lot of what's happening now in developed countries, Canada and US and other countries, is not even so much the issue of that people, it's misinformation and fake news. This study is still on the internet, and the vaccine movement still continues to actually use it as solid evidence about the dangers of vaccination for measles. And now we're having measles outbreaks continuing to go because fake news and misinformation is spreading like wildfire via social media. And when you look at closely at this, it's still connected to that study. If you think the situation in the US is bad with cases, if you really go across the Atlantic to the Democratic Republic of Congo, the situation there is absolutely catastrophic. There were stories last year before COVID hit that it was actually spreading like wildfire. And we're not talking about cases in the DRC, we're talking about deaths. Remember, Ebola killed about 2,100 people. But as of last year, before the end of the year, this actually had killed close to 4,000 children, right? And I looked earlier this year, it was over 6,000. Now, let me step back a bit because I don't want you guys really think that I'm suggesting that what's happening in the Republic of Congo is because of p-values. It's mostly driven by lack of resources and access to care. But what I'm suggesting really is for us to be spending time, money, resources, fighting misinformation and fake news driven by a flawed study, we could be using that resources and everything we have to help countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where really they need everybody's help to be able to do this. But that was before COVID. Nobody's paying attention to what's happening in Congo, right? Forget it now. It's COVID, it's on, and people don't even think about any other countries now. Everybody's thinking about saving themselves. But in Congo, this continues to kill children, right? And what I found even more disappointing is that the movement, the anti-vaccine movement, it's alive. The CBC actually had the whole program about this. I think this was earlier this year or maybe later last year. And they were looking at the history of where did this movement actually begin and where is it today? And guess who was actually at the center of it? The same study with the same guy, really glorified by the anti-vaccine movement. And part of it is because, anybody finding something that claims to harm children, guess what? And especially if it's connected to pharmaceutical industry, everybody is going to jump on it. And who wants to harm children? And the message of the study is that, well, pharmaceutical industry is harming children. And there's strong evidence suggesting this is the case. And everybody believed it. And no matter how much flawedness was revealed about the study, retracted, and so on, unfortunately, this movement is really alive. And if you really want to follow the story, the CBC has this on their website to see really how vibrant this movement is. Because of now, at the time when the study was published, nobody actually thought there would be an era where social media would be what it is today with misinformation and fake news. I really, what I'm suggesting that really statistical significance, it may have really helped us in many ways to really perhaps help us design better studies, but we've struggled with it in terms of misinterpretation of information. Perhaps we could shift our focus a little away from it and focus on other dimensions of really clinical relevance that could be of help. So this really move of trying to push to dethrone it or get rid of it, there's merit to it. Perhaps if we can't get rid of it, which I don't think we'll ever be able to get rid of it, at least not in my lifetime. Perhaps we could find other ways to de-emphasize it and focus more on reporting and interpreting results, that we have a better sense of magnitude of effects and how precise those effects are. This may help us to be able to do things better. Certainly, I don't think changing practice completely would be possible, but collectively, we can actually make some improvements. With this, I will stop and stop sharing my screen, and then we can have some discussion.
Thanks, Lahana. That's great. Lots of positive comments I've received on a very, very erudite and clear presentation of an extraordinarily difficult topic. And I feared when you asked me if you could do rounds that you'd be talking about Bayesian statistics, rolling their eyes, and they'll be worse. That's great. Before I get into the actual questions, I want to ask you a sort of fairly provocative question. I was reading recently of a poll that 40%, and this may, who knows what the actual fraction is, but it's not zero, of US physicians think that hydroxychloroquine is highly effective for COVID. So I would posit that the American Statistical Association has a much bigger problem than kind of navel gazing about the value of the p-value, in that the whole concept that you started at the top, that H.G. Wells kind of introduced, that people should be thinking statistically, is fundamentally not accepted by the population. And the education mission of people, of organizations like the ASA, should actually be to try to teach people that they need to understand what this means, because if 40% or 30% or 20% or some fraction of US physicians thinks hydroxychloroquine is effective for COVID, you have a much bigger problem than with whether people understand the p-value. Any thoughts about that?
Oh my goodness. Well, I don't know what I'm going to say will really make much sense, but to be honest, don't expect much from us as statisticians. Look, we practice the way we are taught, right? We're not taught how to communicate evidence. We're not taught, we're all learning how to do this thing through trial and error. There's no formal training of how to actually communicate anything to anybody, let alone really communicating issues of evidence to the public. So I don't think statisticians really would be of any help. Of course, over time, people who are very good at it, and there are lots of statisticians who are good at it, they just had to learn it on their own through trial and error. Our education system don't actually provide that. I'm not sure even really in clinical medicine, there's deliberate training in how people really should communicate evidence better. So it's a lot harder where you're competing against people who are trained how to communicate to convince, which are the media and the press. We should all be trained how to communicate the way information should be communicated the same way is done by the press. But how many academics really learn to become journalists? Very few. So, I mean, I see a lot of these problems really being about leaving the task of communicating information to the public, to people who are not trained as scientists, but the scientists being in the back burner, hoping that others will do that job effectively. But we all communicate with different motives and incentives. I'm not sure whether the incentives of a press person and motive would be the same as or that of a scientist.
Yeah, it's probably a call to action, right? The call to action, I would posit, should not just be to have, again, intellectual arguments about the value of p-values. It's that also, it needs to be coupled with a highly effective communication strategy that builds on some of the stuff that you just mentioned, to make sure that it doesn't just confine to the pages of a journal, which 0.0003% of the population actually reads, and less than half of those actually understand what it's saying. I'll just get to the questions in the question and answer box. So Dr. Yeshka asked a question I think is really quite interesting, is if there's a problem with p-values and individual studies that are very fragile, as you very clearly identified, does meta-analysis help this, because it can include positive and negative studies, and it does, by its very design, increase the sample size that contributes to the final analysis?
Yes and no. I mean, part of why I say yes and no is, of course, in many cases, the evidence shows that where we have a lot of the small studies that have smaller p-values, the issue is lack of statistical power. And perhaps if we pool all this evidence from different studies, we're able to increase that a bit to be able to then get there. However, We also have lots of empirical evidence in different clinical areas where pulling evidence from small trials has actually shown to be leading to results that are completely different from a single large trial that was done to actually show whether something is effective. So, and part of it is because even things that may seem to be similar in many ways, and typically the small trials are not of high quality, they may be different in terms of the rigorousness of how things were done. So doing small studies with the hope of, well, we'll pull at the end is certainly not a panacea. I think there was a debate some years back about this, and Mac was actually involved in that debate as when could we actually rely on small studies with the hope that if we don't show that effects are significant, perhaps if we pull things together, it would actually do that. I mean, look, we rely on replication for every evidence. And you know, we do it in one study through replicating it in a lot of patients. And of course, we know that one study is not good enough. We replicate across all studies. But just because we've replicated something in several studies, it doesn't necessarily mean pulling it together would actually have something useful or good. Actually, the whole hierarchy of evidence needs to be really articulated. PJ has actually been one of the people advocating. It's got to be replication of large, well-done trials, not just any trial. And quite often, unfortunately, people believe that if it's a trial, it must be good. If I pull trials, I must be doing something good.
Thanks, Lahana. A number of questions about, you don't have an answer to this, I suspect. If we're going to try to get larger experiences to inform clinical relevance, how do we get around the problem of it being difficult to publish negative studies? And again, I'm sure you don't have an answer to that, but you'll have thoughts, I'm sure.
Well, this is why this is difficult. So I think everybody now is aware about the requirement to register trials, right? And this was really an attempt to deal with publication bias. So a journal editor said, well, we want everybody to publish all trials, and we therefore require that if someone is doing a trial, they should actually register it so we know that somebody's doing a trial and they don't publish it, we'll go back and say, where are the results? And however, even though all journals, clinical journals have signed on to this, none of them actually commits to publishing any of those trials. So we still fall a step short that, yes, we are requiring and making mandatory for people to register them, but we're saying, but you know, don't expect me, we're not, and the reason is very simple why journals are reluctant to do this, because everybody wants to publish the one that's going to get them a lot of citation and increase the impact factor, right? So I'm not sure whether it would actually solve this because there's just too many conflicts of interest in how to best approach it, to be honest.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And Herzl Gerstein I'll just read it. That's not really, I think it's just what you said. This is Herzl's comment. The problem is not the p-value or whatever you use. The problem is that there are people who use any metric as a weapon versus evidence. This includes CI, other estimates, p-values. Evidence is not proof, and that non-mischievous public needs to be educated on the issue. COVID has shown that clearly. So I think you would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Erwin Walker asked a question. I'll just read it. A frequent type of publication states that endpoint X, the primary endpoint, showed statistical significance, but survival was not affected. Obviously, the trial was underpowered for a survival difference. Why do you think that journals allow such conclusions? And do journals bear guilt for bad conclusions? Interesting question.
Well, to be honest, I'm using the word journals and all that stuff, which may seem like I'm saying it's somebody else's fault. All of us are editors of journals. We sit on editorial boards, we review journals, we publish. It's all collective responsibility. I mean, so many journals don't have methodologists or statisticians as core reviewers for them, and they rely on the goodwill of people doing that. And so no wonder why this really keeps to happen, but it is not the fault of the journals alone. But remember, I said again, all journals really are led by academic people. So, when we're talking about journals, we're talking about ourselves. So, it's all collective responsibility.
And journals are businesses, right? And they'll cease to exist if they don't
Of
generate
course.
revenues. And
Yeah.
the only way they generate revenue is by getting notoriety and getting people to read them. So I think it's a bit of you're passing the buck when you blame a journal, because, as you just said, the journal is us, but more importantly, we're the ones who are then reading that journal and supporting the model that's in there.
Yeah.
Dr. Satch asked a question here. One of the issues is that medical treatment and getting FDA approval for drugs is based on phase 3 registration studies, and this often hangs on the p-value. So the p-values become the master judge in determining whether a company makes billions of dollars or loses billions. So I really, how much does the FDA, how much blame does the FDA bear for this? And I just point out again my comment at the start that I think there's real danger in blaming the FDA for this, because the FDA is becoming less evidence-based, and it's going to make an even more convenient scapegoat, but I don't think it's actually the root cause of the problem. But I'd be interested in your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, the FDA relies on collaborations and partnership with academic institutions to do what it does. So it still boils again to really the entire culture of academic discourse in terms of really how we practice science. I have no doubt if there was a major shift in how we practice science in academia, FDA would have no challenge in evolving. So what's happening if FDA reliance on people is just a reflection of what happens in the real academic science. So they can be seen to be so far off. And of course, FDA itself, it puts itself in lots of conflict of interest. There's lots of conflict of interest throughout the way FDA, for those of you who might not know, it's actually supported by the very same industry that they're trying to, police. So a lot of their support also comes from pharmaceutical industry. And pharmaceutical industry, their bottom line is to make money. For us, sometimes our bottom line is to survive. Academic institutions also make it difficult for scientists to actually behave well. So everybody, no matter our best intentions, we are all placed in conflict of interest.
Yeah, I totally agree. Herzl points out that the FDA is a regulator and it's not a scientific body, and I totally agree with that. So we've got 2 minutes left, and this will be the last question. There's many questions that I apologize we just won't get to because we don't have time, but I'll give you 2 minutes to explain what your approach to Bayesian statistics are, and is this a solution for this? And before you say, I'll just preface it with my thought and say, if we can't get people to understand the basics of simple statistics, I can't imagine explaining to the population what a Bayesian statistic is. Can you give us your thoughts?
Well, and you're right, and part of it is because we don't have a lot of graduate courses in science or health research methodology that include Bayesian thinking or Bayesian methods. So we don't have a lot of mentors around to support people in Bayesian statistics. To be honest, Bayesian statistics is not that hard to understand. It's just that we don't have enough people trained in it to be able to actually educate everybody about it. And because we don't have that, and lots of people are not trained in it, people who could actually use it and apply it well, they're reluctant for fear that, oh, I've never seen that in my journal. So I don't want to be the only one doing this. I just want to get this study published, right? So, I mean, I've had colleagues who are incredibly reluctant to go that direction. And I understand their fears because they say, I've never seen anybody in my discipline actually doing a Bayesian trial. And we may not have enough reviewers who will understand it when you submit it for granting agencies and so on. So we just don't have enough support for Bayesian thinking.
Thanks, Lahana. That was great. We should end there just in interest of time. So I'd like to thank Lahana for a really clear and very understandable presentation. I've actually learned a great deal during this. That's great. Hope the attendees found it useful. Next week, we'll return to our usual weekly grand rounds led by Dr. Azam and Dr. Ingram. We'll be back in early December for an update on COVID. We have Dr. Shelley McNeil, who's the director of the Canadian Centre on Vaccinology, and our own Dr. Zane Chagla, who are going to give us an update on where we are with COVID just before Christmas. And I'd like to thank you, Lahana, and all the people who've watched, and also all the people who asked questions that I apologize we didn't get to. There were many questions that we didn't get to. So thanks very much. Have a great day, everybody. And we'll see you here in a month and next week for our regular grand rounds. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.